Tom Beckett had spent years saving up for a place where he could finally work in peace, somewhere with enough space to house his growing collection of classic cars in need of restoration, a garage big enough to hold his tools, his lifts, his welding equipment, and enough room to breathe without feeling like he was crammed into a corner of a rental property or someone else's backyard. He had moved too many times, dealt with too many landlords who didn't appreciate the constant sound of grinding metal or the smell of motor oil lingering in the air. This house was supposed to be the solution to all of that, the perfect space, the final move, the place where he could put down roots and never have to explain himself to anyone again. He had searched for months, sifting through overpriced listings, touring houses that looked good in photos but turned out to be disasters in person, before finally stumbling across the one that checked every box. The house itself was nothing extraordinary, a solid 3-bedroom structure built in the 70s with a little bit of character but nothing flashy. The real appeal was the garage, a detached structure large enough to fit 4 vehicles comfortably, with reinforced concrete flooring, high ceilings, and enough outlets to handle his equipment without needing to rewire the entire place. It was everything he had ever wanted, a personal sanctuary, a space that belonged to him and only him. The first few weeks were exactly what he had hoped for. He spent his days setting up the garage, installing new shelving, bolting down his workbenches, organizing his tools in a way that made sense instead of working around the chaos of a shared space. He had already started his first major project, a 1969 Mustang that had been sitting in a salvage yard for years, rusted to hell but still salvageable with the right amount of patience and effort. He had been looking forward to this build for months, waiting for the right space to bring it back to life, and now that he finally had it, he wasted no time diving into the work. It was satisfying, in a way that nothing else in his life had been for a long time, to have complete control over his environment, to know that no one was going to walk in and tell him he needed to clear out, to not have to worry about a lease expiring or a noise complaint shutting him down. For the first time in years, he felt completely at ease. Then he met his neighbor. Vince McKelvey introduced himself the way people do when they want to make sure you understand that they have been here longer than you, that they know how things work around here, and that you would do well to follow their lead. He was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with tan skin that made it clear he spent a lot of time outdoors, the kind of guy who always seemed to be standing with his feet planted just a little too wide apart, like he was getting ready to take a swing at something. The first time they spoke, Vince made it clear that he considered himself a fixture of the neighborhood, someone who had been around long enough to have a say in how things were run. He was friendly in the way that some men are when they're sizing you up, testing the waters to see if you're going to be a problem. At first, the conversation was pleasant enough, just the usual neighborly small talk, but then Vince glanced over at the garage, at the wide driveway, at the empty space that Tom had deliberately kept clear for his work, and that's when the conversation took a turn. "You've got a lot of room over here," Vince said, nodding toward the driveway. "Before you moved in, we kind of used this area for parking when things got tight. Street's not that wide, and sometimes you've got people coming over, you know how it is. The guy before you didn't mind." Tom knew exactly what Vince was doing. He had seen this type before, the kind of person who acted like the street belonged to them, who expected everyone else to fall in line with whatever unspoken rules they had decided were in place. He had specifically bought this house because of the garage and the driveway. He wasn't about to let it turn into a communal parking lot for his neighbor's overflow. "Yeah, I get that," Tom said, keeping his tone even. "But I've got a lot of projects going on and I need to keep that space open. It's part of the reason I bought the place." Vince held his smile for a moment longer than necessary, then nodded. Sure, just thought I'd ask." That should have been the end of it, but Tom had a bad feeling as he watched Vince walk away, the way his eyes lingered on the garage, the way his expression flickered for just a second before he turned back toward his house. He had dealt with guys like this before, the kind who didn't like being told no, the kind who believed that everything around them belonged to them by default. He tried to push the thought aside, convincing himself that he was overreacting, that maybe Vince really had just been asking and that was the end of it. But the next night, when Tom came home from picking up some parts for the Mustang, there was a black pickup truck parked across the driveway. It wasn't blocking him in completely, but it was close enough to be a problem, close enough that it sent a clear message. Tom sighed, set down the bags of parts he had just carried inside, and walked next door. Vince opened the door with a beer in his hand, music playing from somewhere inside. "Hey," Tom said, keeping his voice neutral. "Looks like someone parked in my driveway." Vince took a slow sip of his beer, glancing past Tom like he had only just noticed. "Oh yeah, that's my buddy's truck. We had a few guys over. He'll move it in a bit." Tom exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'd appreciate it if it wasn't parked there at all. Like I said, I need to keep that space clear." Vince shrugged. "Like I said, he'll move it. No big deal." But it was a big deal. The next morning, the truck was still there. Tom had to knock again, this time with less patience, and after another round of excuses, Vince finally called his friend to move it. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Over the next week, more cars started appearing, always just close enough to be a nuisance, never fully blocking the driveway but always making it clear that Vince wasn't letting this go. Trash started appearing near the fence line, beer cans, cigarette butts, food wrappers, the same kind of garbage every time. Maybe it was a coincidence, maybe not. Then, one morning, Tom stepped outside and found deep, deliberate scratches running along the side of his truck. Not random scuffs from a careless passerby. Deep, jagged lines carved into the paint, stretching from the front fender all the way to the rear panel. Tom stared at the damage for a long moment, his fists clenching at his sides. That wasn't an accident. That was a message. Tom didn't go to Vince's house right away. He stood there for a long time, staring at the deep scratches running along the side of his truck, feeling the slow, simmering burn of anger building in his chest. He had spent years working on this vehicle, tuning the engine, restoring the body, repainting every inch by hand, and now someone, Vince, or one of his idiot friends, had taken a key or a knife or some other sharp object and deliberately carved into it like it was nothing. It wasn't just vandalism. It was personal, a direct challenge, a way of saying, "I can do this and you can't stop me." He took a slow breath, then another, forcing himself to stay calm, because storming over there now wouldn't accomplish anything. He needed to think, to decide exactly how he was going to handle this, because if he lost his temper, if he gave Vince the reaction he was looking for, it would only escalate things further. He pulled out his phone and snapped a few pictures of the damage, making sure to get the angle of the scratches and the depth of the grooves. He'd have to call his insurance company, but he already knew how that conversation would go. Without proof of who did it, they'd treat it like any other case of vandalism, maybe cover some of the repair costs, maybe not. He considered calling the police, but again, what would they do? Show up, take a report, file it away somewhere, and forget about it. Without evidence, they wouldn't even bother questioning Vince, and Tom had no doubt that Vince would act clueless if they did. He knew guys like him, arrogant, entitled, the kind who pushed just enough to get under your skin but never enough to face real consequences. This wasn't just about parking anymore. Vince wanted to send a message, to make it clear that he wasn't going to be told what to do, that he could do whatever he wanted without consequences, and that was exactly why Tom couldn't let this go. He spent the next few hours going about his usual routine, not because he wasn't angry, but because he refused to let Vince dictate how he spent his day. He went into the garage, worked on the Mustang for a few hours, methodically disassembling the engine, letting the familiar rhythm of work steady his breathing. But the anger never really went away, just settled into something colder, sharper. He wasn't going to let this go, but he also wasn't going to play whatever game Vince thought they were playing. He had dealt with assholes like this before, people who mistook patience for weakness, who thought they could push and push without ever getting pushed back. Tom wasn't the kind of man to start fights, but he sure as hell knew how to finish them. That night, he locked up the garage and stepped outside, letting the cool air clear his head. The neighborhood was quiet, most of the houses dark, except for the occasional glow of a porch light. Vince's house, however, was still buzzing with activity. There were at least 3 cars parked out front, the same ones he had seen coming and going all week, the same ones that always seemed to find their way near his driveway. He could hear music playing, the low thump of bass vibrating through the walls, and the sound of laughter, Vince's voice, loud and cocky, carrying through the night. Tom stood there for a long moment, watching the house, his fingers twitching at his sides. He could go over there right now, demand answers, force Vince to admit what he had done, but that wouldn't accomplish anything. Vince would just smirk, shrug, deny everything, and even if Tom managed to get a confession out of him, what then? It wouldn't undo the damage. It wouldn't change the fact that Vince had already decided this was some kind of pissing contest. No, if Vince wanted to play games, Tom would just have to be smarter about how he played back. The next morning, he got up early and called a local security company. By noon, they were out installing cameras, one above the garage, one overlooking the driveway, another near the back fence where Vince's property line met his own. He didn't say much to the workers, just let them do their job, knowing that the sight of the cameras alone would be enough to piss Vince off. He wasn't stupid. He knew cameras wouldn't stop someone like Vince if he was determined to cause trouble, but at the very least, they would make sure that if something happened again, he'd have evidence. He wasn't playing defense. He was setting the stage for the next move. Sure enough, it didn't take long for Vince to notice. That evening, as Tom was locking up the garage, he heard footsteps crunching on the gravel behind him. He turned to find Vince standing at the edge of the driveway, beer in hand, his expression carefully neutral. "Security cameras," Vince said, nodding toward the one mounted above the garage door. "Bit much, don't you think?" Tom didn't rise to the bait. He just shrugged, had some vandalism, figured it was a smart investment. Vince chuckled, taking a slow sip of his beer. "Yeah, well, neighborhood's changing, I guess. Used to be people just talked things out, handled shit like men." Tom met his gaze evenly. "Nothing stopping you from talking now." For a second, Vince just stood there, weighing his options. Then he shook his head and grinned like this was all some big joke. "Relax, man. Just giving you a hard time. Hope you didn't waste too much money on those things." Tom didn't respond. He just watched as Vince turned and walked away, humming to himself, shoulders relaxed, posture casual, like he hadn't just admitted to knowing exactly why the cameras were there. Tom exhaled slowly, flexing his hands, feeling the tightness in his knuckles. He had expected Vince to react, but the way he had done it, calm, amused, completely unconcerned, made it clear that he wasn't the least bit worried. That was the problem with guys like Vince. They never thought anything could touch them. Over the next few days, things escalated in small but deliberate ways. More trash on his property, more cars parked just close enough to be a nuisance. One morning, he found a long, oily smear across the pavement near his garage, the kind that didn't happen by accident. Someone had poured something there, something meant to stain, to leave a mark. He cleaned it up without comment, refusing to give Vince the reaction he wanted, but inside his patience was wearing thin. He wasn't going to let this go on forever. And then, the fire happened. It started just after midnight. Tom had been asleep when the smoke alarm blared through the house, jolting him awake with a rush of panic. He threw the blankets off, his mind still catching up to what was happening as he stumbled toward the source of the noise. The acrid smell of burning plastic hit him first, sharp and unmistakable, and then he saw an orange light flickering through the garage windows, shadows dancing wildly against the walls. His stomach dropped. By the time he yanked the door open, flames were already crawling up the side of the garage, licking at the roof, sending thick, black smoke billowing into the night sky. His first instinct was to grab the fire extinguisher, but one look told him it was already too late for that. This wasn't some small spark or an accidental electrical fire. This was deliberate. This was gasoline accelerant, something planned. He grabbed his phone, his hands shaking as he punched in 911. Someone had set his garage on fire, and he already knew exactly who it was. Tom barely registered what he was saying to the dispatcher as he gave his address, his voice tight with urgency while his eyes stayed locked on the flames devouring his garage. The fire had already spread across the entire left side, swallowing the wooden shelves he had installed just weeks ago, the workbench covered in expensive tools, the cabinets filled with carefully cataloged parts for his restoration projects. He had seconds, maybe a minute, before the whole thing became an unstoppable inferno. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus, ignoring the tightening in his chest as he ran toward the outside power shutoff, flipping the main breaker to cut electricity to the garage before the flames reached the wiring and turn this into something even worse. The heat was already unbearable, radiating against his face as he backed away, scanning the area around the structure for anything he could use. His first instinct was to grab the garden hose, but as soon as he turned the nozzle, he realized how pointless it was. The weak stream of water barely reached the edge of the fire, evaporating almost instantly against the searing wood. He threw the hose down, his jaw clenched, watching helplessly as the fire continued its merciless advance. Then the explosion came. A sudden violent burst as something inside the garage, a gas can, an aerosol canister, a battery ignited, sending a fireball roaring into the air and shaking the ground beneath him. The force of it knocked him back a step, and he shielded his face from the wave of heat that followed. He could hear sirens in the distance now, wailing through the quiet streets, but it was too late. He already knew it. This wasn't going to be a savable situation. His garage, his tools, his cars, everything inside gone. The fire department arrived in force, several trucks pulling up, firefighters already moving with practiced efficiency, shouting commands to one another as they unrolled hoses and attacked the blaze with industrial-grade power that made his earlier efforts look pathetic. Tom stood back, watching, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his breath coming in sharp bursts as he forced himself to stay still, to not let the rage bubbling under his skin turn into something reckless. The neighbors had started gathering, stepping out onto their porches, lingering on the sidewalks, drawn by the unmistakable glow of the fire and the deafening chaos of the emergency response. And then he saw him, Vince. Standing a few houses down, arms crossed, head tilted slightly as he watched the flames with an expression that was just a little too neutral, a little too composed for someone who had just witnessed their neighbor's garage go up in flames. Tom felt something inside him snap, his pulse hammering as he started moving before he even realized what he was doing. He didn't care about the firefighters, the neighbors, the flashing lights, or the fact that the police were probably already on their way. He closed the distance between them in long, determined strides, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles ached. Vince saw him coming but didn't move, didn't even flinch, just stood there waiting, and that infuriated Tom more than anything else. He stopped just inches away, close enough to smell the beer on Vince's breath, close enough to see the slight upward twitch of his mouth, like he was barely restraining a smirk. Tom's voice was low, steady, barely more than a growl. "You think this is funny?" Vince's expression didn't change. "I don't know what you're talking about." Tom's fingers twitched at his sides, aching to grab the front of Vince's shirt, to slam him against the nearest wall, to force something real out of that smug, indifferent face. "You did this," he said, his voice colder now, sharpened with something more dangerous than just anger. "You or one of your little friends. You think I don't know." Vince exhaled through his nose, shaking his head like he was dealing with a child throwing a tantrum. "That's a hell of an accusation," he said, "especially when you've got no proof." The words hit exactly the way Vince intended them to. Tom knew it. And that was the worst part. He didn't have proof. He didn't have footage. He didn't have a witness. He had nothing except the knowledge deep in his bones that Vince had done this, that this was payback for the cameras, for the driveway, for not playing along with whatever bullshit neighborhood hierarchy Vince thought he controlled. But knowing wasn't enough. Not legally. Not yet. Before he could say anything else, a voice cut through the tension. "Sir, step back." Tom barely turned his head to see a uniformed officer approaching, his expression already unreadable, professional, the kind of look cops wore when they were expecting trouble and were preparing to shut it down before it started. Tom let out a slow breath through his nose, forcing himself to step back, to loosen his fists, to keep himself from making a mistake that would put him in handcuffs instead of Vince. The officer glanced between them, eyes flicking briefly to Vince, who had adopted an exaggeratedly relaxed posture, arms loose at his sides, his stance just casual enough to make it clear that he wasn't the problem here. "What's going on?" the officer asked. Tom didn't answer immediately. He was still staring at Vince, still seeing the fire reflected in his eyes, still feeling the heat licking at his skin, still hearing the explosion rattling in his skull. But what was he supposed to say? That he knew Vince had done it? That he could feel it in his gut, in the same way a man could feel a storm rolling in, before he even saw the clouds? That wasn't enough. It would never be enough. So instead, he exhaled and said, "Nothing. We're done here." The officer hesitated for a second longer, then gave a small nod, turning back toward the fire trucks, clearly more concerned with the still burning remains of the garage than whatever was happening between two neighbors. Tom finally turned away from Vince, but not before catching the barely there smirk on his face, the one that said, "That's what I thought." The fire burned for another hour before the last embers were finally extinguished, leaving behind nothing but charred wreckage and the lingering stink of melted plastic and scorched metal. Tom spent most of the night giving statements, answering questions, standing in the cold watching as his garage, the one thing he had worked so hard to build, the one place that was supposed to be his sanctuary, was reduced to nothing but a blackened skeleton. When the fire chief finally approached him, clipboard in hand, his expression was sympathetic but professional, and Tom already knew what he was going to say before the words left his mouth. "No sign of an electrical issue," the chief said. "No indication that this was an accident." Tom nodded slowly, his throat tight. "But no proof it was arson," he said. The chief hesitated. "Not yet. We'll keep investigating." Tom wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe that they would find something, that the truth would come out, that Vince would be held accountable. But he had seen enough in his life to know better. He wasn't stupid. He knew how these things worked. There would be an investigation. A few more questions. And then, eventually, the case would go cold. No leads, no suspects, no resolution. Just a burned-down garage and a neighbor who thought he was untouchable. Tom clenched his jaw, staring at the wreckage, his hands curling into fists at his sides. That was fine. If the system wasn't going to handle Vince, then Tom would just have to do it himself. Tom had never considered himself a man with a short temper, but standing in front of the smoldering remains of his garage, the twisted metal, the charred framework that had once been the heart of everything he had built, he realized there was a difference between being patient and being a fool. For years, he had been the kind of man who thought things through before acting, the type who understood that rushing headfirst into a situation without thinking could do more harm than good. But this wasn't just a setback, wasn't just an unfortunate accident, wasn't something he could chalk up to bad luck. This was deliberate. This was personal. This was Vince letting him know, in the clearest way possible, that he could take whatever he wanted, do whatever he pleased, and no one would stop him. No police, no investigation, no consequences. That was the message, loud and clear. The firefighters had done what they could, but there wasn't much left to salvage. The roof had collapsed entirely, the vehicles inside reduced to little more than blackened husks. The tools he had spent years collecting twisted and melted beyond recognition. He hadn't even bothered trying to step inside after the fire was out, knowing there was nothing left to save. When the fire chief finally came over, clipboard in hand, expression carefully measured, Tom already knew what he was going to say. "There's no immediate sign of an electrical malfunction," the man said, flipping through his notes. "No indication this was an accident." Tom clenched his jaw. "Which means what?" Exactly, the chief sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It means we're treating this as suspicious, but without clear evidence of arson, there's not much we can do yet." Tom didn't respond right away, just nodded once, forcing himself to swallow the bitter frustration rising in his throat. Suspicious. That was the word they used when they knew something was wrong but couldn't do a damn thing about it. He spent the rest of the night dealing with the aftermath, answering questions from the fire department, giving a statement to the police that he knew would go nowhere, watching as his property was reduced to nothing but blackened debris under the harsh glare of emergency floodlights. By the time the last truck pulled away and silence settled over the neighborhood, he felt hollowed out not by grief or loss, but by something colder. Determination. He didn't sleep. Instead, he sat on his porch, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in his hands, his eyes locked on Vince's house across the street. The bastard had barely reacted when the fire started, hadn't rushed outside like the rest of the neighbors, hadn't looked concerned, hadn't asked if he needed help. He had just stood there watching, waiting. And when Tom had confronted him, he had smiled. That smug, infuriating smirk that made it clear he wasn't worried. Because he knew there was no proof. No cameras left intact to catch him in the act. No witnesses willing to say they saw him do it. He knew Tom couldn't do a damn thing. That was going to change. By morning, Tom was already making calls. He didn't go to the police again, didn't waste time filing another report that would sit unanswered. Instead, he focused on reinforcing what was left. He installed new security cameras, not just around his house but covering every inch of his remaining property. He upgraded the locks, reinforced the doors, replaced the motion sensors Vince had so conveniently destroyed in the fire. He wasn't going to let the bastard think he had won. Vince noticed. That evening, as Tom was adjusting one of the cameras above his front porch, he heard the familiar crunch of boots on gravel. He didn't turn right away, finishing what he was doing, letting the silence stretch until he was ready. When he finally turned, Vince was standing at the edge of his driveway, arms crossed, a beard dangling from one hand. Security cameras, Vince said, nodding toward the one mounted above the garage door. Bit much, don't you think? Tom wiped his hands on a rag, keeping his expression blank. Had some vandalism. Figured it was a smart investment, Vince chuckled, taking a slow sip of his beer. Yeah, well, neighborhood's changing, I guess. Used to be people just talked things out, handled shit like men. Tom met his gaze evenly. Nothing stopping you from talking now. For a second, Vince just stood there, weighing his options. Then he shook his head and grinned like this was all some big joke. Relax, man. Just giving you a hard time. Hope you didn't waste too much money on those things. Tom didn't respond. He just watched as Vince turned and walked away, humming to himself, shoulders relaxed, posture casual, like he hadn't just admitted to knowing exactly why the cameras were there. Tom exhaled slowly, flexing his hands, feeling the tightness in his knuckles. He had expected Vince to react, but the way he had done it calm, amused, completely unconcerned made it clear that he wasn't the least bit worried. That was the problem with guys like Vince. They never thought anything could touch them. For the next few days, Tom kept his routine as normal as possible. He rebuilt what he could, focused on securing what was left, made it clear that he wasn't going anywhere. He saw Vince watching sometimes, lingering near his truck, talking to some of his friends, always smirking, always looking just a little too pleased with himself. Tom ignored it. He wasn't going to play Vince's game. He was going to end it. Then, one night, something changed. It was past midnight when Tom heard a noise just outside near what was left of the garage. He didn't move immediately, didn't react, just opened his eyes slightly, listening. Footsteps. Slow, careful, deliberate. Someone trying to move quietly but not quite succeeding. He kept still, breathing evenly, waiting. The footsteps continued, moving along the side fence, pausing near the back, then starting again. Someone was testing the perimeter, seeing if he was awake, if he would react. Tom reached for the gun he had placed beside him, his fingers wrapping around the cool metal grip. He didn't stand up yet, didn't make a sound, just waited. The footsteps stopped. A long silence stretched out. Then, in the dim light, he saw a shadow moving near the fence line, the outline of a figure just barely visible against the dark. That was enough. He stood up abruptly, flipping on the powerful floodlights he had installed earlier that day, bathing the entire yard in blinding white light. The figure flinched, caught off guard, and for a split second, Tom saw the face. Vince, caught in the act. They locked eyes across the yard, neither of them speaking, the air between them heavy with unspoken threats. Tom didn't raise the gun, didn't need to. The message was clear enough. Vince lingered for a second longer, then without a word, turned and walked away, slipping back into the darkness. Tom stood there, his grip on the gun tightening, his pulse a steady, controlled rhythm in his ears. He had won this round, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning he woke to something new. A note taped to his front door. No threats, no insults, just a single, handwritten sentence in neat, almost careful script. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Tom read it twice, then crumpled it in his fist, his jaw tightening. Good. Let him think that. Let him think Tom didn't know. Because Vince had just made his second mistake, and Tom was going to make damn sure it was his last. Tom read the note again, his fingers tightening around the crumpled paper as his eyes flicked toward Vince's house. The bastard wanted him to know this wasn't over, that the fire was just the beginning, that there was more to come, and that Tom wasn't ready for it. But Vince had underestimated him. He had mistaken patience for weakness, thinking that because Tom hadn't retaliated, because he hadn't gone storming over there with fists swinging, he was scared. He wasn't. He was waiting, watching. And now that Vince had finally made a mistake, now that he had gotten too bold, too confident, Tom was done waiting. He didn't react right away. He didn't go to Vince's door, didn't demand answers, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing an immediate response. He knew guys like Vince, men who thrived on control, who needed to feel like they were dictating the pace of a fight. That was why he had left the note in the first place. He wanted to get inside Tom's head, make him paranoid, force him into making a mistake. Tom wasn't going to give him that. Instead, he took the note inside, smoothed it out on the kitchen counter, and studied the handwriting. It was too neat, too precise for Vince. Someone else had written it, which meant Vince wasn't acting alone. That wasn't surprising. Guys like him never worked alone. They surrounded themselves with people who thought the same way, who backed them up, who made sure there was always plausible deniability. It was never just one guy. That meant this wasn't just about Vince anymore. Tom spent the next few days reinforcing everything. He replaced the standard locks on his doors with reinforced deadbolts, installed secondary locks on the windows, and set up additional motion sensors around the perimeter of the house. He upgraded the security cameras, adjusting their angles so that every blind spot was covered, making sure that if anyone tried to approach the house, they wouldn't just be seen, they would be recorded in high definition. He wasn't being paranoid. He was preparing. Because Vince wasn't going to stop. The silence lasted for 2 days. No cars parked too close, no trash dumped on his property, no late-night noises near the fence line. It was almost enough to make him think maybe the note had been a bluff, a final attempt to get under his skin before Vince backed off. But Tom didn't believe in coincidences. The quiet wasn't peace. It was the deep breath before a storm. The storm hit on the third night. Tom had been working late in what remained of the garage, salvaging whatever tools hadn't been completely ruined by the fire. He had been so focused on what he was doing that he didn't hear the truck until it was already too late. The roar of the engine came first, then the flash of headlights cutting through the darkness, blinding him for a split second before he realized what was happening. The truck wasn't just passing by, it was coming straight for him. He moved on instinct, throwing himself to the side just as the vehicle barreled through what remained of the garage door, metal shrieking as it was torn apart, debris flying in every direction. He hit the ground hard, rolling to avoid the shards of wood and glass raining down around him, his ears ringing from the impact. For a moment, all he could hear was the sound of his own breath, rapid and uneven, the pounding of his heart like a drumbeat in his skull. Then the truck reversed, its tires screeching against the pavement as it backed out of the wreckage, leaving behind nothing but destruction and the thick, acrid stench of burning rubber. By the time Tom pulled himself to his feet, the truck was already disappearing down the street, taillights glowing red in the distance. He didn't need to see who was behind the wheel. He already knew. Vince had finally stopped pretending. Tom stood there for a long moment, breathing heavily, his hands shaking at his sides, his entire body tense with adrenaline. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. Vince had crossed a line. He had taken things beyond petty harassment, beyond threats, beyond property damage. This was an escalation into something else entirely, and the fact that he had done it so boldly, so openly, meant one thing: he thought he was invincible. He thought Tom wouldn't do anything. He was wrong. Tom didn't call the police. He knew exactly how that would go. They would come, take a statement, maybe drive by Vince's house, ask a few questions, and then leave, telling him that unless there were witnesses or clear evidence, there wasn't much they could do. He wasn't going to waste his time with that. Instead, he went inside, grabbed his laptop, and pulled up the security footage. It was all there. The truck approaching, speeding up, smashing through the remains of the garage, but the angle wasn't great. The headlights had washed out most of the details, making it difficult to make out the driver's face. Tom sat back, exhaling slowly. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. He wasn't going to get the police involved, but he wasn't going to let this slide either. Vince wanted to play dirty. Fine. Tom could play dirty too. The next morning he put his plan into motion. He didn't go straight to Vince's house. That would have been too obvious. Instead he waited. Watched. He knew Vince would slip up eventually. And when he did, Tom would be ready. It happened faster than he expected. That afternoon Vince had visitors. 3 men, all of them rough-looking, the kind of guys who carried themselves like they had spent more time in bar fights than boardrooms. Tom watched from his porch as they stood around Vince's truck, talking in low voices, occasionally glancing in his direction. He didn't look away, didn't pretend not to see them. He wanted them to know he was watching. He wanted them to know he wasn't afraid. Then, just as the group was about to disperse, something unexpected happened. One of the men, taller than the others, with a thick beard and a scar running down the side of his face, broke away from the group and walked straight toward Tom's house. Tom didn't move, didn't flinch, just waited as the man stopped at the bottom of his porch steps, looking up at him with a faint smirk. "You're making things real complicated," the man said. Tom met his gaze evenly. "I'm not the one driving trucks through people's garages," the man chuckled, shaking his head. "Vince says you've been causing problems. Says you don't know when to let things go." Tom tilted his head slightly. "And what? You're here to convince me otherwise?" The man's smirk widened. "Just a friendly warning," Tom exhaled through his nose, nodding slowly. "Good. Then here's mine." He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen, pulling up the footage from the night before. He turned it toward the man, letting him watch the grainy but unmistakable video of Vince's truck plowing through the garage. The man's smirk faltered just slightly. "You tell Vince that I'm not the one who doesn't know when to let things go," Tom said, "and if he wants to keep pushing, he's not going to like where this ends." The man studied him for a long moment, then, without another word, turned and walked away. Tom watched as he rejoined Vince, murmuring something low under his breath. Vince's expression darkened, his posture shifting just slightly. He wasn't smiling anymore. Good. Let him think about that. Because Tom wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Tom knew the next move would come soon. Vince wasn't the type to let a challenge hang in the air for long, not after the message Tom had sent. The fact that Vince hadn't reacted immediately was the only real surprise, but Tom figured that meant he was trying to come up with something bigger, something final, a way to end this in a way that made it clear who was in control. That was fine. Tom was ready. He had spent the last week making sure of that. The security measures were in place, the cameras were backed up to multiple locations, his property was reinforced, and most importantly, he had made sure that Vince knew, without a doubt, that he wasn't afraid. The attack came on a Sunday night, later than expected, but just as vicious as Tom had predicted. He had been in the house, reviewing footage from the last few days, making note of anything unusual, when the first noise reached him, something metallic, a dull clatter against the back fence, a sound too deliberate to be an accident. He didn't react immediately, didn't move, just reached for the pistol he had been keeping within arm's reach every night since the garage had burned. He flicked the safety off, his other hand already reaching for his phone, pulling up the live feed from the cameras. The night vision view came up in crisp black and white clarity, showing exactly what he had expected. Vince and 2 other men, crouched low near the back gate, dressed in dark clothes, moving with the kind of careful intent that told Tom this wasn't just another scare tactic. They weren't here to leave another message. They were here to finish what they started. Tom had known this was coming, but seeing it unfold in real time sent a sharp current of adrenaline through his body, heightening every sense, every instinct. He moved quickly, silently, killing the lights inside the house as he made his way toward the back door, keeping close to the walls, avoiding any direct lines of sight from the windows. He had spent enough years handling dangerous situations to know that panic got people killed. This wasn't the time for rage, for reckless confrontation. This was about control, and if Vince thought he was the only one who knew how to play this game, he was about to learn otherwise. Outside, the men had reached the gate. One of them, a stocky guy with a shaved head, pulled something from his pocket, a pair of bolt cutters. Tom exhaled slowly through his nose, watching as the man positioned the blades around the lock. He could end it right there, could step outside and put a bullet in the ground, let them know exactly how badly they had miscalculated. But he didn't. He let them keep going, let them make the decision themselves, let them commit to the act before he made his move. The lock snapped with a muffled crunch. The gate swung open, and they stepped inside. That was when Tom moved. The floodlights exploded to life, washing the yard in a harsh, blinding glow. The men recoiled, hands flying up to shield their eyes, momentarily disoriented. Tom stepped forward, gun raised, voice steady and cold. "Don't move." Vince reacted first, blinking rapidly against the sudden brightness, his body tensed like a coiled spring. The other two hesitated, exchanging quick, uncertain glances, the stocky one still holding the useless bolt cutters like they were going to help him now. Vince recovered fast, his expression twisting into something close to amusement. "Put the gun down, Tom." Tom didn't move. "You really want to test that theory?" A long, tense silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of everything that had led up to this moment. Tom's heartbeat was steady, his grip unwavering. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't playing a role. He knew it. Vince knew it. The other two sure as hell knew it. Then Vince smiled. It wasn't the cocky smirk he had worn all those times before, wasn't the arrogant, untouchable grin he had flashed in the aftermath of the fire, the note, the truck through the garage. No, this was something else. Something darker. "You're not going to shoot me, Tom," he said, his voice low, almost amused. "Because if you were, you'd have done it already." Tom exhaled slowly, measuring his response, choosing his next move carefully. Vince was playing the odds, betting that Tom was too smart, too cautious, too unwilling to cross that final line. And maybe he was right. Maybe Tom wasn't a killer. But that didn't mean he was defenseless. He didn't lower the gun, didn't change his stance. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, just enough to gesture toward the nearest security camera. "You're on film," Tom said. "All of you." They got a reaction. The stocky guy stiffened, glancing toward Vince, looking for direction. The third man, silent up until now, shifted uncomfortably, taking a small step back, like he was already reconsidering his choices. Vince's expression flickered just for a second, just enough for Tom to see the realization settle in. He had expected a fight, he had expected threats, maybe even violence. But what he hadn't expected was this: documentation. Proof. "Everything from the past week," Tom continued, his voice calm but firm. "The truck. The note. And now this. I don't need a gun, Vince. I already won." The silence that followed was different from before. He could feel the shift, the way the tension changed, the way the weight of the situation finally settled on Vince's shoulders. Then, without a word, Vince turned and walked back toward the gate. The other two hesitated only a moment longer before following. Tom watched them go, his grip on the gun unwavering until the last shadow disappeared into the night. Then, finally, he exhaled. He didn't move for a long time. Didn't lower the gun, didn't turn off the lights. He just stood there, the cool night air pressing against his skin, the adrenaline still humming through his veins. He knew this wasn't the end, not completely. Vince wasn't the type to forget, wasn't the type to let something like this go without looking for another angle. But Tom had taken the power back. He had forced Vince to make a choice to back down or to face consequences he couldn't control. And for now, at least, Vince had chosen to walk away. Tom finally lowered the gun, rolling his shoulders, letting the tension drain from his muscles. He turned, making his way back toward the house, pausing just long enough to glance at the security camera nearest the gate. It had all been recorded. Tomorrow he would make sure that footage was in the right hands. Tomorrow he would make sure Vince understood once and for all that this was over. Tom sat in his living room, watching the footage play on his laptop for the third time, making sure every angle was clear, every detail captured, every face unmistakable. The security system had done its job. The cameras had recorded everything the moment Vince and his men broke the lock, the second they stepped onto Tom's property, the exact instant they froze under the floodlights, the way Vince had hesitated just long enough to realize how badly he had miscalculated. It was all there, time-stamped, high definition, indisputable. There was no version of this where Vince could claim misunderstanding, no lie he could spin to make himself the victim. This wasn't hearsay. This wasn't some petty neighborly dispute. This was criminal trespassing, destruction of property, and an attempt at something far worse. Tom didn't bother calling the police. He had done that before. He knew how it would go. They would take the report, maybe send someone by to speak with Vince, maybe write up a citation if they felt generous, but it wouldn't change anything. Vince would find a way to twist it, to play it off, to keep himself just out of reach of real consequences. No, Tom wasn't going to waste time hoping for the system to work in his favor. He had another plan. He pulled out his phone, sent the footage to 3 different places, one to his lawyer, one to a trusted friend in town who worked in security, and one to an online storage account, ensuring that no matter what happened, the evidence wouldn't disappear. Then he waited. The next morning he saw Vince for the first time since the confrontation in the yard. The bastard had the audacity to step outside as if nothing had happened, stretching in the sunlight, his posture just a little too casual, just forced enough to let Tom know he was still trying to project control, still trying to pretend that everything was fine. But Tom saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted toward Tom's house before he could stop himself, the way his usual arrogant smirk didn't quite reach his eyes. He was nervous. Good, let him be. Tom didn't acknowledge him. He didn't need to. He had already made his move. He just stood on his porch, sipping his coffee, waiting, watching. The call came an hour later. Vince's voice was different now. Gone was the smug confidence, the casual condescension, the thinly veiled threats disguised as neighborhood small talk. Now there was something else: hesitation, calculation, an edge of uncertainty creeping into the spaces between his words. "We need to talk." Tom didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, let Vince sit in it, feel the weight of it. "I'm listening," Tom finally said. "Not like this," Vince said, lowering his voice as if someone might be listening. In person, Tom considered that. He wasn't afraid to meet Vince face to face, not anymore. The balance had shifted. Vince wasn't in control of this anymore. But that didn't mean Tom was stupid. He had dealt with men like Vince before. Their survival depended on manipulation, on twisting situations to their advantage, on finding the cracks in their opponent's defenses and prying them open. If Vince wanted to talk, it meant he thought he could still salvage something. That was interesting. "Fine," Tom said. "Your place or mine?" Vince let out a short breath, almost a laugh. "Neutral ground, where?" There was a pause, then the diner on Main. 30 minutes. Tom hung up without another word. When he arrived, Vince was already there, sitting in the farthest booth, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that he hadn't touched. His eyes flicked up as Tom approached, scanning his face, his posture, his expression, looking for something, anything he could use. Tom didn't give him anything. He slid into the booth across from Vince, leaning back against the cracked vinyl seat, waiting. For the first time since they had met, Vince was the one who looked uncomfortable. His usual bravado was gone, replaced with something closer to quiet frustration, a man who had expected to win and was now scrambling to figure out how the hell he had ended up here. "I'll make this simple," Tom said before Vince could speak. "You're done." Vince's fingers tapped against the ceramic mug, the only sign of whatever was churning in his head. "That's so." "You know it is." A tense silence stretched between them. Vince exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Look, man, I get it. I pushed too far. We both did. But this he gestured vaguely, his hand hovering in the space between them, as if referring to the entire mess without wanting to name it. This is bad for both of us. Tom almost laughed. Vince was trying to spin this into a mutual problem, as if Tom had been an equal participant in the destruction of his own property, as if he had willingly played the game Vince had forced him into. No, Tom said simply. This is bad for you. Vince's jaw tightened. What do you want? Tom leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. I want you gone. Vince let out a short, humorless laugh. Not happening. Then we have a problem. Vince stared at him, eyes narrowing, looking for an angle, an opening, a way out. What if I say no? Tom smiled. It wasn't friendly. Then I send the footage to everyone I know, including the police, the neighborhood board, and a couple of local journalists who love stories about assholes like you. He tilted his head slightly. I wonder how many of your friends would still back you up once they see exactly what you've been up to. Vince's expression flickered just for a second, just enough for Tom to see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He was weighing his options, trying to decide whether he could still salvage his position, whether there was a way to fight back, or whether it was time to cut his losses. You really want me to leave that bad? Vince finally asked. Tom didn't break eye contact. Yes, a long silence. Then, finally, Vince exhaled, a slow, measured breath. Fine. Tom nodded once. You have a week. Vince looked like he wanted to argue, wanted to push back, wanted to find a way to regain control. But he didn't. He just leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his hair, staring past Tom, out the diner window, as if already imagining himself somewhere else. Tom stood, tossing a few bills on the table for the coffee he hadn't ordered, then turned to leave. He didn't need to hear anything else. A week later, Vince was gone. The house sat empty for a while, the blinds drawn, the driveway finally clear. Eventually, a for sale sign went up in the yard. Tom watched the process with quiet satisfaction, the weight in his chest easing for the first time in months. He had won, but victory didn't feel like celebration. It felt like relief. It took time to rebuild. The garage was gone, but that was temporary. He had already started drawing up plans for a new one, bigger, stronger, built to last. The damage Vince had done would fade, repaired piece by piece, and eventually, his presence would be nothing but a bad memory. One evening, Tom sat on his porch, watching the sunset, a beer resting on the arm of his chair. The neighborhood was quiet again, peaceful. No loud music, no unwanted cars, no tension lingering in the air. For the first time in a long time, it felt like home.